My hands trembled as I watched our chief of surgery stumble through the operating room doors, the sharp smell of whiskey cutting through the sterile air like a knife through flesh. Dr. Marcus Henderson, the man everyone called a miracle worker, the surgeon parents drove hundreds of miles to see, could barely focus his bloodshot eyes on the surgical instruments laid out before him. In exactly 15 minutes, he was supposed to perform a complex heart valve repair on Emily Chen, a bright 13-year-old girl who loved playing violin and had dreams of attending Juilliard one day. I glanced around at my fellow nurses, watching as they all suddenly found something fascinating about the floor tiles, their silence speaking volumes about the unspoken rules we all lived by in this prestigious Chicago hospital. 23 years of nursing experience had taught me to trust my instincts, and every fiber of my being screamed that this was wrong, that we were about to witness something catastrophic unfold in slow motion. I pulled off my sterile gloves with a sharp snap that echoed in the tense silence, the sound making several nurses flinch as if I'd fired a gun. Racing down the hallway, my white shoes squeaking against the polished floors, I headed straight for Dr. Patricia Wells, our chief medical officer, who had her office on the 7th floor with its panoramic view of Lake Michigan. The elevator ride felt eternal, each floor number lighting up like a countdown to a confrontation I knew would change everything. Dr. Wells sat behind her mahogany desk, her perfectly manicured fingers dancing across her keyboard as she reviewed quarterly profit reports, the numbers on her screen showing record-breaking revenue for our cardiac surgery department. When I burst through her door, without knocking, she barely glanced up, her expression shifting from mild annoyance to calculated coldness as I explained what I'd witnessed. "Dr. Henderson is clearly intoxicated," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "He cannot perform surgery on that child. We need to postpone and get another surgeon." She leaned back in her leather chair, a smile playing at the corners of her lips that made my skin crawl. "That's quite an accusation, right?" She glanced at Sarah Mitchell, "Do you have any proof beyond your personal observations?" The way she said personal observations made it clear she already knew exactly what was happening and had no intention of stopping it. "I've worked in operating rooms for over 2 decades, I replied, standing straighter. "I know what alcohol smells like, and I know what impaired motor function looks like. His hands are shaking, his speech is slurred, and he's having trouble maintaining his balance." Dr. Wells stood slowly, walking around her desk to face me, her heels clicking ominously on the hardwood floor. "Dr. Henderson generates $12 million annually for this hospital. He's performed over 3,000 successful surgeries. Are you really suggesting I pull him from an operation based on your intuition?" My stomach churned as she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt more threatening than any shout. "Besides, Sarah, everyone knows about your little vendetta against Dr. Henderson. It's been, 14 months since that unfortunate misunderstanding at the holiday party?" The memory hit me like a physical blow, transporting me back to that December evening when Henderson had cornered me in the empty conference room after everyone else had left. He'd pressed me against the wall, his hands roaming where they had no business being, his whiskey-soaked breath hot against my neck as he whispered what he wanted to do to me. When I'd threatened to report him, he'd laughed and said no one would believe a middle-aged, divorced nurse over the hospital's star surgeon. The next morning, the entire hospital buzzed with gossip about how I'd supposedly thrown myself at him, how he'd had to politely reject my advances because he was happily married with 3 beautiful daughters. My protests fell on deaf ears, and I'd spent months rebuilding my reputation while he continued his reign as the hospital's golden boy. "This has nothing to do with last year," I said firmly. "This is about a child's life being put at risk right now." Dr. Wells returned to her desk, her fingers hovering over her phone. "Get back to that operating room immediately, Nurse Mitchell. And if you breathe another word about these baseless accusations to anyone, I'll make sure you never work in healthcare again. Not in Chicago, not in Illinois, not anywhere in this country." The walk back to the OR felt like a death march, each step heavier than the last as I grappled with the impossible choice before me. In the scrub room, I found Dr. Janet Kim, our head anesthesiologist, mechanically washing her hands, her movements precise but her eyes distant. She'd worked with Henderson for 15 years, had seen him through his divorce, through the death of his son in Afghanistan, through the slow descent into alcoholism that everyone pretended not to notice. As I re-scrubbed, she spoke without looking at me. "I've already given him something to steady his hands," she said quietly, and my blood ran cold. "Janet, you can't be serious. You're medicating him so he can operate while drunk?" She finally met my eyes, and I saw something broken in her gaze. "What choice do I have, Sarah? You think I don't know this is wrong? But I have 2 kids in college, a mortgage, elderly parents in a nursing home. If I refuse to work with him, Wells will destroy me, just like she's destroyed everyone else who's spoken up." Her voice cracked slightly as she continued. "Besides, I've been involved with Marcus for the past 6 months. His wife doesn't know. No one knows. And if I don't support him now, when he needs me most—" She trailed off, and I noticed the elegant tennis bracelet on her wrist, the one I'd seen Henderson's wife wearing at last year's fundraising gala. We entered the OR to find Henderson already positioned at the operating table, his hands steadier now thanks to whatever Janet had given him, but his eyes still unfocused, his judgment still clearly impaired. Emily Chen lay small and vulnerable on the table, her chest rising and falling steadily under anesthesia, completely unaware that her life was in the hands of a drunk surgeon and a team too frightened to stop him. Through the observation window, I could see Emily's mother, Linda Chen, a woman who'd taken 3 weeks off from her job as a corporate attorney to be here for her daughter's surgery, pressing her hands against the glass as if she could somehow protect her child through sheer force of will. The initial incision was shaky but manageable, Henderson's years of muscle memory partially compensating for his impairment, but as the surgery progressed and we moved deeper into the delicate work of repairing Emily's mitral valve, the situation deteriorated rapidly. His depth perception was clearly off, his movements becoming increasingly erratic despite Janet's periodic touches to his arm to steady him. At one point, he actually giggled, as he nearly dropped a clamp into Emily's chest cavity, catching it at the last second and making a joke about butterfingers that no one laughed at. The moment everything went catastrophically wrong is burned into my memory with the clarity of a high-definition photograph. Henderson was attempting to place a suture in the delicate valve tissue when his hand trembled violently, the needle slipping and puncturing the left ventricle. Blood erupted like a crimson geyser, flooding the surgical field instantly. "Clamp! I need a clamp now!" Dr. Rodriguez, the assisting surgeon, shouted as he tried to push Henderson aside to take over, but Henderson, in his impaired state, pushed back aggressively.
"I've got it under control,"
he slurred, even as Emily's blood pressure plummeted and alarms shrieked around us. The next few minutes unfolded in a chaos of controlled panic. Dr. Rodriguez finally managed to shove Henderson away from the table, calling for backup surgeon stat. Units of blood arrived as we scrambled to repair the damage, the perfusionist working frantically to keep Emily's heart-lung bypass functioning, while her life hung by an increasingly thin thread. Through it all, I kept glancing at the observation window, watching Linda Chen's face transform from concern to confusion to absolute horror as she realized something had gone terribly wrong. The way her legs gave out, the way she pressed both hands against the glass as tears streamed down her face, the way her mouth formed a silent scream. These images would haunt my dreams for months to come. We managed to stabilize Emily after what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes of the most intense medical intervention I'd ever witnessed. The damage to her heart was severe. What should have been a routine valve repair had turned into a catastrophe that would likely require a complete heart transplant. As we closed, Dr. Wells herself appeared in the OR, her face a mask of professional concern that didn't reach her eyes. She patted Henderson's shoulder as if he were a little league player who'd struck out rather than a drunk surgeon who'd nearly killed a child. "These things happen," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Complications are always a risk, even in routine procedures. We'll handle the family appropriately." Then she turned to address the entire surgical team, her gaze lingering on each of us in turn. "I trust everyone understands the importance of discretion. We're a family here at Chicago Presbyterian, and families protect each other. Anyone who suggests this was anything other than an unfortunate but unforeseeable complication will face immediate termination and legal action for defamation. Our legal team is very, very good at protecting the hospital's interests." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud as we filed out of the OR, each of us carrying the weight of what we'd witnessed and the terrible knowledge that we were expected to lie about it. I couldn't sleep that night, replaying the surgery over and over, seeing Emily's blood on the floor, hearing her mother's sobs when the carefully scripted explanation was delivered. Around 3 a.m, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my life forever. I began documenting everything I could remember about the surgery, writing down times, names, specific details about Henderson's condition, Janet's admission about medicating him, Wells' threats. I knew I was potentially signing my career's death warrant, but I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent. The next morning brought a surprise that would prove to be the first crack in the hospital's seemingly impenetrable wall of silence. I was called to the administrator's office, expecting to face more threats, only to find myself served with legal papers. But unlike the cease and desist order I expected, these were subpoenas. As I read through them in confusion, I found a handwritten note tucked between the pages. "I know what really happened in that OR. Please be my star witness. We're going to make them pay for what they did to my daughter. Linda Chen, senior partner, Chen, Rothstein and Associates." My confusion must have shown on my face because the process server, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, leaned in and whispered, "She's not just any lawyer. She's the Linda Chen, the one who took down Pharmatech Industries for hiding cancer risks. The one who won that $300 million judgment against Detroit General for patient deaths. Your hospital just performed malpractice on the wrong person's kid." A strange mix of fear and hope flooded through me as I realized the implications. Linda Chen wasn't just a grieving mother, she was one of the most feared medical malpractice attorneys in the Midwest, with a team of investigators and resources that could pierce through any cover-up. The retaliation began almost immediately after word spread that I'd been served with papers that looked different from everyone else's. My schedule became a weaponized chaos, changing multiple times per shift without notice. I'd arrive for my regular cardiac unit rotation only to be told I'd been reassigned to the psychiatric ward, then pediatric emergency, then geriatric care, always the most challenging units with the most difficult patients. Each reassignment came with a patronizing note about expanding my skill set and cross-training opportunities, but the message was clear: make my life miserable enough that I'd quit voluntarily. My electronic access began mysteriously failing at critical moments. My badge would work fine at the employee entrance but fail at the medication room. My computer login would function for email but freeze when I tried to access patient records. The IT department always had explanations about system updates and server issues, but curiously, no other nurse seemed to experience these widespread technical difficulties. When I tried to document these incidents, the computers would crash, eating my reports and leaving no trace of my complaints. The psychological warfare escalated as rumors about my supposed substance abuse problem spread like wildfire through the hospital's gossip network. It started with whispers about me seeming off during shifts, evolved into stories about me slurring my words or stumbling in hallways, and culminated in elaborate tales of me stealing medications from the pharmacy. Anonymous tips were called into the nursing board about my erratic behavior, triggering mandatory drug tests that I passed every time, though the rumors persisted despite the clean results. Someone, I never found out who, gained access to my social media accounts and posted increasingly concerning messages. Photos from a wine tasting event 2 years ago were reposted with captions about numbing the pain and when the bottle becomes your best friend. My LinkedIn profile was edited to include references to seeking new opportunities in a less stressful environment and taking time to focus on personal wellness, changes I didn't make but couldn't prove I didn't make. The digital assassination of my character was methodical and devastating. My assigned patients became increasingly challenging, though I suspected this wasn't entirely coincidental. I'd get the combative dementia patient who'd already injured 2 other nurses, the family members who'd filed complaints against multiple staff members, the cases with the highest risk of complications. During one particularly brutal shift, I was assigned 6 high-acuity patients simultaneously, double the safe ratio, while other nurses on the floor had 3. When I questioned the charge nurse, she shrugged and said it was based on seniority and capability, though nurses with less experience had lighter loads. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest part of the campaign against me. Conversations ceased when I entered break rooms, leaving awkward silences that stretched like accusatory fingers. Nurses I'd worked alongside for years, who'd celebrated birthdays with me, whose children I'd watched grow up, through photos and stories, now avoided eye contact and found urgent tasks whenever I approached. Even my closest friend on the unit, Maria, who'd been my rock through my divorce 5 years earlier, pulled me aside to whisper that she couldn't afford to be seen talking to me anymore. She had just adopted a baby and couldn't risk her job. During one particularly dark evening shift, I found my car in the parking garage with all 4 tires slashed. Security claimed the cameras in that section had been malfunctioning for weeks, though they'd worked fine the day before and miraculously started working again the day after, sir. The next week, my locker was found open with its contents scattered across the floor, including personal photos that had been defaced with red marker. The word liar was scrawled across a picture of me at my nursing school graduation, the accomplishment I'd been most proud of, now twisted into something shameful. The physical toll of the harassment began to manifest in ways I couldn't hide. I lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks, my appetite vanishing under the constant stress. Dark circles became permanent fixtures under my eyes as insomnia took hold, my mind racing through each shift's new humiliations and plotting how to survive the next day. My blood pressure, always perfectly normal, spiked to dangerous levels, requiring medication for the first time in my life. The irony of needing medical care while working in a hospital that was systematically destroying me wasn't lost on me. My mother, living in a retirement community in Naperville, noticed the changes immediately during our weekly lunch dates. "Sarah, honey, you look like a ghost," she said, reaching across the restaurant table to grasp my trembling hands. "This job is killing you. No one would blame you for walking away." But I couldn't explain to her that walking away felt like letting them win, like allowing Emily Chen to become just another casualty of a corrupt system. I couldn't tell her about the nightmares where I watched that surgery happen again and again, each time staying silent, each time watching Emily die while I did nothing. The breaking point came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening when I discovered my nursing license was under formal review. An anonymous complaint had been filed with the state board, alleging that I had been diverting narcotics for personal use. The complaint included security footage that supposedly showed me pocketing medications during my shifts. When my attorney obtained the footage through Discovery, we found something chilling. The videos had been digitally altered with sophisticated deepfake technology, showing me performing actions I'd never taken in locations I'd never been. The technical analysis of the falsified footage revealed just how far the hospital was willing to go to silence me. Timestamps had been manipulated, my image had been superimposed onto another person's body, and entire sequences had been fabricated from whole cloth. But to the untrained eye, to anyone who didn't know to look for the digital artifacts and inconsistencies, the footage was damning. It showed me slipping vials into my pockets, altering medication counts, even appearing impaired during patient interactions. The creation of this false evidence must have cost thousands of dollars and required significant technical expertise. Linda Chen's legal team moved into high gear when they learned about the falsified evidence. Her investigators had been building a comprehensive case, but the discovery of deliberate fraud elevated everything to a new level. They subpoenaed hospital servers, email records, and security systems. They interviewed former employees who'd left under suspicious circumstances. They followed paper trails that led to offshore accounts and shell companies used to hide financial irregularities. What started as a medical malpractice case was evolving into something much larger, a RICO investigation into systematic corruption. The dam finally burst when Janet Kim, the anesthesiologist, reached her own breaking point. She appeared at my apartment one night, soaked from rain and shaking with sobs. "I can't do it anymore," she cried, clutching a box of documents. "I've been keeping records. Every time they made me medicate him, every surgery where he was impaired, every cover-up. It goes back 3 years, Sarah. 3 years of putting patients at risk." The documents she'd been secretly compiling were devastating. Dates, times, drug combinations used to steady Henderson's hands, post-operative complications that were hidden or misattributed, and even audio recordings she'd made of conversations with Wells about managing Henderson's problem. The investigation expanded rapidly as more witnesses came forward. A surgical tech who'd been fired for poor performance after reporting Henderson's drinking revealed she'd been blacklisted from every hospital in the city. A pharmacist who'd questioned the unusual patterns in Henderson's prescription requests had been transferred to night shifts until he quit. A young resident who'd tried to report the situation to the medical board had found his residency mysteriously terminated for unprofessionalism. Each person had been isolated and silenced, but together their stories painted a picture of institutional corruption that reached the highest levels of the hospital. The FBI raid on Chicago Presbyterian happened on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. I was drawing blood from a patient when suddenly the hallways filled with federal agents in blue windbreakers. They seized computers, boxed up files, and escorted several administrators out in handcuffs. Dr. Wells was arrested in her office, still sitting at the desk where she'd threatened me months earlier. Henderson was taken from the physician's lounge where he'd been drinking coffee spiked with vodka at 8 a.m. The sight of them being led away in handcuffs should have felt like vindication, but all I felt was exhaustion and sadness for the patients who'd been failed by a system that prioritized profits over lives. The trial became a media sensation, with every major news outlet covering the story of the prestigious hospital that had protected a drunk surgeon at the cost of patient safety. Linda Chen was a force of nature in the courtroom, systematically dismantling the hospital's defense with precision and barely contained fury. When she played the audio recordings of Wells discussing how to manage Henderson's drinking problem while maintaining surgical schedules, several jurors visibly recoiled. The testimony about Emily's surgery, with multiple witnesses confirming Henderson's intoxication, left spectators in tears. My own testimony stretched across 3 grueling days. The defense attorneys tried every tactic to discredit me, bringing up my divorce, my financial struggles, even a decade-old patient complaint that had been dismissed as baseless. They painted me as a bitter, vindictive woman seeking revenge for rejected advances. But Linda's redirect examination was masterful. She walked me through my 23-year career, the commendations I'd received, the lives I'd saved, the integrity I'd maintained until it cost me everything. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, the truth was undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Henderson was convicted of aggravated assault, practicing medicine while intoxicated, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. He received 8 years in federal prison and permanently lost his medical license. Wells got 12 years for racketeering, conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The hospital itself faced criminal penalties that would ultimately force its closure and sale to a non-profit healthcare system committed to reform. But the legal victories felt hollow compared to the personal costs. Emily Chen survived and eventually received a heart transplant, but she could never play violin again. The complications from the botched surgery had caused nerve damage that affected her fine motor control. Her dreams of Juilliard were replaced with a different path, though she showed remarkable resilience, eventually becoming a patient advocate herself. The guilt I carried about not being able to prevent her suffering never fully went away, even as she insisted I'd done everything I could. The financial settlement was substantial, $32 million to Emily's family, $8 million to me, and millions more to the other victims who came forward. But money couldn't buy back my reputation in the immediate aftermath. Despite being vindicated in court, I found myself effectively blacklisted from bedside nursing. Hospitals saw me as a liability, a troublemaker who might expose their own dark secrets. Applications went unanswered, interviews that seemed to go well ended with polite rejections. The very act of standing up for patient safety had made me unemployable in the field I loved. It was Linda Chen who suggested a different path forward. "You have a gift," she told me over coffee 6 months after the trial. "You see what others are trained to ignore. You speak up when others stay silent. That's not a liability. That's a superpower in the right context." She helped me establish a consulting firm focused on healthcare ethics and patient safety. Hospitals hired me to assess their cultures, identify potential problems, and create systems that would encourage rather than punish whistleblowing. The transition from bedside nursing to consulting wasn't easy. I missed the direct patient care, the satisfaction of starting an IV on a difficult stick, the joy of seeing a patient walk out healthy after arriving at death's door. But I found new purpose in preventing the kind of tragedy that had befallen Emily Chen. Every policy I helped craft, every toxic culture I helped transform, every healthcare worker I empowered to speak up, these became my new ways of healing. I developed training programs for nurses on recognizing and reporting impairment in colleagues. The sessions were always emotional, as healthcare workers struggled with the conflict between loyalty to colleagues and duty to patients. I shared my story not as a hero's tale, but as a cautionary example of what happens when fear silences conscience. We role-played difficult conversations, discussed legal protections for whistleblowers, and created support networks for those facing retaliation. The program, dubbed Speak Up, Save Lives, was eventually adopted by nursing schools across the country. My personal life, shattered by the ordeal, slowly began to rebuild. The isolation I'd experienced during the retaliation had shown me who my real friends were. Maria, who'd been forced to distance herself during the worst of it, came back with apologies and tears. She'd left Chicago Presbyterian shortly after my vindication, unable to work in a place that had done such evil. We resumed our friendship with a deeper understanding of how institutional pressure can break even the strongest bonds. Dating seemed impossible at first. Who would want someone with such a complicated past? But I eventually met David, a journalist who'd covered the trial and reached out years later for a follow-up story. He was patient with my trust issues, understanding when I'd panic about running into former colleagues, supportive when nightmares about that surgery would wake me in cold sweats. He saw me not as a troublemaker or a victim, but as someone who'd faced an impossible choice and chose integrity. We married in a small ceremony at my mother's retirement community, surrounded by the people who'd stood by me through the darkness. The ripple effects of the case continued for years. Chicago Presbyterian was purchased by a nonprofit health system that implemented radical transparency measures. They created an anonymous reporting system for safety concerns, established an independent patient advocacy board, and instituted mandatory reporting for any suspected impairment. The Henderson Protocols, as they came to be known, became a model for hospitals nationwide. It was a bittersweet legacy, policies written in a child's blood, but policies that would prevent future tragedies. Janet Kim served 2 years in minimum security prison for her role in the cover-up. I visited her once, finding a broken woman who'd lost her medical license, her freedom, and her self-respect. "I loved him," she said simply, staring at her hands. "I thought I was protecting him, but I was just enabling him to hurt people." She worked in the prison library, teaching literacy to other inmates, trying to find redemption in small acts of service. I forgave her that day, understanding how love and fear could twist good people into accomplices of evil. The speaking circuit became an unexpected part of my new life. Medical conferences, nursing schools, healthcare ethics seminars, they all wanted to hear the story from someone who'd lived it. I always started with Emily Chen, making sure audiences understood that this wasn't about my heroism, but about a system that had failed a 13-year-old girl. I showed them her picture, bright eyes, braces, violin case in hand, and asked them to imagine their own children on that operating table. The rooms always went silent then, the weight of potential tragedy settling on every healthcare worker present. One particularly memorable speaking engagement was at Henderson's former medical school. The dean had invited me to address incoming students about medical ethics and the pressures they'd face in their careers. Standing in the same auditorium where Henderson had likely taken his Hippocratic oath decades earlier, I talked about how good doctors can lose their way, how institutional pressures can corrupt even the most talented physicians, how the culture of medicine often protects its own at the expense of patients. The students listened with rapt attention, some taking notes, others wiping away tears as I described Emily's surgery. After one such talk, a young medical student approached me, visibly shaken. "My attending has been showing up smelling like alcohol," she whispered, "but he's brilliant, and everyone says I'm lucky to learn from him. What do I do?" This became a common occurrence. Healthcare workers seeking guidance when faced with their own ethical dilemmas. I always gave them the same advice. Document everything, find allies, use proper reporting channels, and if all else fails, be prepared to sacrifice your position for your patients' lives. It was hard advice to give, knowing the cost, but necessary. The consulting work evolved to include expert witness testimony in other whistleblower cases. I'd review medical records, assess whether proper protocols were followed, and testify about the culture of silence in healthcare. Each case was a reminder that Chicago Presbyterian wasn't unique. Hospitals across the country harbored their own dark secrets, their own protected predators, their own cultures of complicity. But each successful case also proved that change was possible, that individuals could stand up to corrupt systems and win. 5 years after the trial, I received an unexpected letter. Emily Chen, now 18 and preparing for college, wanted to meet. I'd followed her recovery from a distance, respecting her family's privacy, but always wondering how she was truly doing. We met at a quiet cafe in Lincoln Park, and I barely recognized the confident young woman who walked in. The physical scars were hidden beneath her sweater, but her emotional resilience shone through every word and gesture. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply, stirring her tea with steady hands. "Not for saving my life, the other doctors did that, but for making sure it meant something, for making sure other kids won't go through what I did." She told me about her plans to study healthcare policy, to work on systemic reforms that would prevent medical errors and cover-ups. Her violin sat silent in her childhood room, but she'd found a different kind of music in advocacy work. She volunteered with patient safety organizations, spoke at medical conferences, turned her trauma into purpose. The meeting with Emily led to a collaboration that became one of my most meaningful projects. Together, we developed a patient safety curriculum that included both the healthcare worker and patient perspectives. Emily would share her experience of being helpless on that operating table, trusting the professionals around her, never knowing how close she came to death because of one impaired surgeon and a complicit system. I would talk about the moral injury of participating in that surgery, the cost of speaking up, and the importance of maintaining ethical standards especially when, it's hard. Our program was piloted at Northwestern University's medical school, then expanded to nursing and pharmacy programs. We called it First Do No Harm, the true meaning of medical ethics. The sessions were intense, often emotional, always transformative. Students would approach us afterward, shaken by the realization of how easily good intentions could be corrupted by institutional pressures. Some would share their own experiences of witnessing questionable practices during clinical rotations, expressing relief at finally having language and frameworks for addressing their concerns. The 10th anniversary of the surgery brought unexpected media attention. Journalists wanted retrospectives, updates on where everyone was now, analyses of what had changed in healthcare culture. I agreed to one comprehensive interview with a major news magazine, mainly because they also interviewed Emily and several nurses who'd found the courage to report problems in their own hospitals after hearing our story. The article, titled "The Surgery That Changed American Healthcare," traced how one 13-year-old girl's near-death experience had catalyzed nationwide reforms. Dr. Rodriguez, the surgeon who'd pushed Henderson aside and saved Emily's life, became a powerful ally in reform efforts. He'd carried his own guilt about not speaking up sooner, about all the times he'd noticed Henderson's impairment but rationalized it away. He now headed a physician wellness program that addressed substance abuse in medical professionals, approaching it as a health issue requiring treatment rather than a shameful secret requiring cover-ups. His program had helped dozens of doctors get clean while protecting patients from impaired practitioners. My mother lived to see my vindication and reinvention, passing peacefully just after my consulting firm's 10th anniversary. She'd been my anchor through the storm, never doubting my decision to speak up, always reminding me that integrity was worth any price. Her funeral was attended by dozens of nurses who'd found courage in my story, patients whose lives had been saved by healthcare workers empowered to report dangers, and colleagues from my new career who saw me as a pioneer in medical ethics consulting. Clearing out her apartment, I found a box of newspaper clippings she'd saved about the case. Every article, every update, every mention of the reforms that followed, she'd preserved them all. At the bottom was a letter she'd written but never sent, dated during the worst of the retaliation. "My daughter stands alone against giants, but she stands. When the history of nursing is written, her name will be there among those who refuse to let fear silence truth." I could not be prouder. The letter remained on my desk, a reminder of why we do the right thing, even when it costs everything. The consulting firm grew beyond my wildest dreams, eventually employing 15 specialists in healthcare ethics, patient safety, and organizational culture. We worked with hospitals across the country, helping them build systems that encouraged transparency and protected both patients and whistleblowers. And our success rate was measured not in profits, but in lives saved, errors prevented, and healthcare workers empowered to maintain their integrity. Every client engagement began with Emily's story, ensuring they understood the human cost of institutional failures. One of our most significant projects was helping to draft federal legislation protecting healthcare whistleblowers. The Emily Chen Patient Safety Act created robust protections for healthcare workers who report safety concerns, established mandatory reporting requirements for impaired practitioners, and imposed severe penalties for retaliation or cover-ups. The day President Martinez signed it into law, surrounded by patient advocates and healthcare reformers, felt like the culmination of everything we'd fought for. Emily stood beside me at the ceremony, both of us understanding that real change happens through persistence and policy, not just individual acts of courage. Training programs expanded internationally as hospitals worldwide recognized the need for cultural transformation. I found myself in London, Tokyo, Sydney, sharing the lessons learned from Chicago Presbyterians' corruption. The details changed, different healthcare systems, different pressures. But the fundamental challenge remained the same: how to maintain patient safety when institutional interests conflicted with ethical obligations. Every country had its own version of Henderson and Wells, its own culture of silence that needed breaking. My relationship with former colleagues evolved over the years. Some reached out with apologies, explaining how fear had paralyzed them, how they'd wanted to support me but couldn't risk their family's security. I understood. I'd felt that same fear before choosing to act. Others remained distant, perhaps unable to face their own complicity, or perhaps still believing the lies that had been spread about me. Maria became my business partner, bringing her clinical expertise to our consulting work, turning her own guilt about abandoning me into fuel for systemic change. Speaking at nursing schools became my favorite part of the work. These young nurses, just beginning their careers, carried such hope and idealism. I always told them the whole truth, not just the heroic parts, but the messy, painful, costly reality of standing up for what's right. I showed them my graying hair and the stress lines that hadn't been there before the ordeal. I talked about the financial struggles, the isolation, the nights I'd questioned whether speaking up had been worth it. But I also showed them Emily's graduation photo, shared letters from patients whose lives had been saved by empowered nurses, described the deep satisfaction of living with integrity intact. One evening, after a particularly emotional training session where several nurses shared their own experiences with impaired colleagues, I found myself back in Chicago, driving past the old Presbyterian Hospital building. It had been converted into a community health center, the nonprofit operator having stripped away the marble and mahogany to create a facility focused on serving the underserved. The OR where Emily nearly died was now a pediatric clinic providing free care to immigrant families. It seemed fitting. A place of betrayal transformed into a place of healing. I parked and walked through the main entrance, no longer needing a badge, no longer fearing retaliation. The security guard, a young man who couldn't have known the building's history, smiled and asked if I needed directions. I told him I was just remembering, and he nodded as if he understood. The hallways that had once echoed with my footsteps as I fled to report Henderson now bustled with families seeking care. The executive offices where Wells had threatened me now housed social workers and patient advocates. The transformation was complete, but the memories lingered like ghosts in the corridors. In the old cafeteria, now a bright community gathering space, I unexpectedly ran into Emily Chen, one of the nurses who'd been in the OR that day. She looked older, grayer, carrying her own weight from that experience. We sat together over coffee, two women bound by a shared trauma that had shaped our lives in profoundly different ways. "I should have stood with you," she said quietly, staring into her cup. "I knew you were right. We all knew, but I was a coward." I reached across the table and took her hand, feeling no anger, only sadness for the moral injury she'd carried all these years. Susan told me she'd left nursing entirely after the trial, unable to face patients knowing she'd failed to protect Emily. She worked in medical billing now, a job that kept her in healthcare but away from clinical decisions. She'd never married, never had children, as if punishing herself for that moment of cowardice. I shared my own journey, the pain but also the purpose that had emerged from it. By the time we parted, she was considering returning to nursing, perhaps in a setting where she could mentor young nurses about moral courage. The ripple effects continued spreading in ways I never anticipated. A documentary filmmaker, inspired by the case, created a series exploring medical ethics and institutional corruption in healthcare systems worldwide. The episode featuring our story won an Emmy and sparked investigations into 3 other hospitals with similar cover-up cultures. A playwright turned the events into a drama that ran off-Broadway, using theatrical techniques to explore the psychological pressures that enable institutional wrongdoing. Law schools added the case to their healthcare law curricula, examining how legal systems could better protect both patients and whistleblowers. My work evolved to include consulting with medical device manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies on ethical practices. The same dynamics that enabled a drunk surgeon to operate could allow defective devices to reach market or dangerous drugs to remain profitable despite known risks. Every industry had its Henderson, its Wells, its culture of profits over people. The skills developed in healthcare translated across sectors, always with the same core message: transparency saves lives, silence enables harm, and integrity requires sacrifice but delivers meaning. 20 years after that horrible surgery, I received an invitation that brought my journey full circle. Emily Chen, now Dr. Emily Chen, was graduating from Harvard Medical School. She'd specialized in pediatric cardiology, dedicating her career to helping children with the same kind of condition that had nearly killed her. The invitation included a handwritten note. "None of this would have been possible without your courage. You showed me that healing requires not just medical skill but moral bravery. I promise to honor both in my practice." The graduation ceremony was held on a perfect New England spring day, the kind that makes you believe in fresh starts and second chances. Sitting in that audience, watching Emily receive her degree, I thought about the strange mathematics of sacrifice and reward. One surgery gone wrong, one nurse who spoke up, one corrupt system exposed. These individual acts had rippled outward to touch thousands of lives. Emily would save children whose names I'd never know. The nurses trained in our programs would prevent errors I'd never hear about. The policies we'd helped craft would protect patients for generations. After the ceremony, Emily introduced me to her fiancé, a social worker she'd met during her patient advocacy work. They planned to work together in underserved communities, bringing both medical care and systemic reform to places that needed it most. She showed me the stethoscope she'd been given, engraved with the words, "First, do no harm," and the date of her surgery. "I want to remember," she said. "Every time I listen to a heart, I want to remember how close I came to silence and how one person's voice changed everything." The young resident who'd been terminated for reporting Henderson found me at the reception. Dr. James Park had rebuilt his career after the trial vindicated his actions, specializing in addiction medicine. He now ran a treatment center specifically for healthcare professionals, understanding firsthand how the pressures of medicine could break even the strongest people. "You saved my career," he said, emotion thick in his voice. "But more than that, you saved my belief that doing right matters." He'd treated over 200 impaired healthcare workers, getting them help while ensuring patient safety. My own health, battered by years of stress and struggle, required increasing attention. The hypertension from those dark days had left lasting damage. The insomnia had evolved into chronic sleep disruption that no medication fully resolved. My body carried the physical cost of moral courage in ways that blood tests and scans could measure. But sitting in my doctor's office, being treated by physicians trained in systems reformed by our efforts, I felt no regret. Bodies age and fail, but integrity endures. The consulting firm transitioned to employee ownership as I stepped back from day-to-day operations. The younger consultants, many of them healthcare workers who'd faced their own ethical challenges, carried the mission forward with fresh energy and perspectives. They expanded into new areas: artificial intelligence in medicine, genetic testing ethics, pandemic preparedness protocols. The core remained the same: protecting patients, empowering healthcare workers, transforming toxic cultures into healing environments. My marriage to David deepened through shared purpose. He'd written a book about the case that became required reading in journalism ethics courses, exploring how media coverage could either enable or expose institutional corruption. Together, we established a foundation providing legal support for healthcare whistleblowers, ensuring that future truth-tellers wouldn't face financial ruin for their courage. The foundation's first major victory was supporting a group of nurses who exposed patient neglect in a chain of nursing homes, their case leading to federal investigations and systemic reforms. Retirement felt both earned and bittersweet. 45 years after entering nursing school full of idealism about healing and helping, I left a healthcare system transformed but still imperfect. The battles won had revealed how many more remained. Young nurses still faced pressure to stay silent. Patients still suffered from preventable errors. Institutions still prioritized reputation over transparency. But the tools for fighting these battles were stronger, the protections more robust, the culture slowly shifting toward accountability. My final consulting project brought unexpected closure. The nonprofit that had taken over Chicago Presbyterian asked me to help them create a memorial acknowledging the hospital's dark history while celebrating its transformation. We designed a garden space with a fountain at its center, the water representing both the tears shed and the cleansing power of truth. A plaque told Emily's story, not naming her, but honoring all patients harmed by institutional failures and all healthcare workers who risked everything to protect them. The dedication ceremony occurred on a gray November morning, rain threatening but holding off as if granting us this moment of grace. Emily spoke about forgiveness and purpose, her words carrying the authority of lived experience. Former nurses who'd worked at Presbyterian during the dark days planted flowers, each bloom representing a commitment to never again choose silence over safety. Linda Chen, now nearing retirement herself, reminded the gathering that justice delayed but achieved was still justice, that systems could change, that individuals could make a difference. Standing in that garden, I thought about the nurse I'd been that terrible morning when Henderson stumbled into the OR. She couldn't have imagined this moment, the pain that would follow her decision, but also the profound transformation it would catalyze. Every choice creates ripples we can't foresee. Every act of courage inspires others we'll never meet. Every sacrifice for integrity builds a foundation for future good. The rain finally came as the ceremony ended, but nobody rushed for shelter. We stood together, former adversaries, allied reformers, survivors of institutional betrayal, architects of systemic change, letting the water wash over us like a benediction. Emily found my hand and squeezed it. No words needed between us. We'd traveled a long, painful road from that operating room to this garden, but we'd traveled it together and we'd made it mean something. Driving home through familiar Chicago streets, I passed the billboards advertising the area's top hospitals. Each one promised excellent care, advanced technology, compassionate service. I knew now that these promises meant nothing without the courage of individual healthcare workers to uphold them, without systems that supported rather than punished truth-telling, without cultures that valued patient safety over institutional protection. The real excellence in healthcare came from people willing to risk everything for their patients. My phone buzzed with a message from a young nurse in Texas facing her own ethical crisis. Another impaired physician, another administrative cover-up, another choice between career and conscience. I pulled over to respond, sharing resources, offering support, reminding her that she wasn't alone. The network of healthcare integrity warriors we'd built over 2 decades activated, legal advisors and experienced advocates ready to help. This nurse wouldn't face the isolation I'd endured. She'd have an army behind her. That evening, sorting through old files in preparation for donating my papers to a medical ethics archive, I found my original incident report from Emily's surgery. The careful clinical language couldn't capture the terror of those moments, the weight of the decision to speak up, the devastation that followed. But it had been the first document in what became an avalanche of evidence that transformed American healthcare. One nurse, one report, one decision to choose patients over politics. Sometimes that's all it takes to start a revolution. David found me there, surrounded by boxes of memories, and wordlessly began helping me organize the documents. We worked in companionable silence, occasionally sharing a remembered detail or discovered photograph. Here was the cease and desist letter that had terrified me. There was the first news article that had made our story national, a letter from a nurse in Oregon thanking me for giving her courage to report abuse, a child's drawing from a patient whose life was saved by a nurse who'd attended our training, each paper a thread in the tapestry of change we'd woven from tragedy. As night fell over Chicago, I thought about all the nurses beginning their shifts in hospitals across the country. Some would face ethical dilemmas tonight, some would witness wrongdoing, some would have to choose between comfortable silence and dangerous truth. But they'd face those moments in a world where Emily Chen was Dr. Chen, where the Emily Chen Patient Safety Act protected whistleblowers, where training programs taught moral courage alongside clinical skills, where my story proved that speaking up, however costly, could create lasting change. The young nurse from Texas called, her voice shaking but determined. She'd decided to report the impaired physician. She was scared but resolved. I talked her through the process, connected her with local advocates, promised to be available whenever she needed support. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my study, feeling the weight and wonder of legacy. Every nurse who found courage in our story, every patient protected by policies we'd helped craft, every institution transformed from toxic to transparent. These were the true measures of a life's work. Sleep came easier these days. The nightmares mostly faded, replaced by dreams of gardens and fountains and young doctors taking oaths they intended to keep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges to healthcare integrity, new battles between profit and principle, new tests of moral courage. But tonight, there was peace in knowing that one nurse's refusal to stay silent had echoed through decades, creating symphonies of change from a single note of truth. The last thought before sleep was of Emily, no longer the frightened child on the operating table, but a healer in her own right, carrying forward the lesson written in her scars. That integrity costs everything, but gives meaning to everything. That individual courage can transform systems. That speaking truth to power plants, seeds of justice that bloom across generations. In the end, that horrible morning in the OR had become not just a story of corruption exposed, but a testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they refuse to let fear silence conscience. And somewhere in a hospital tonight, a nurse would face her own moment of choice and remember that others had stood where she stood, had chosen courage over comfort, had proven that one voice raised for what's right could become a chorus that reshapes the world. The cycle continued, each generation of healthcare workers inheriting both the challenges and the tools to meet them, each individual decision to speak truth, adding another note to the ongoing symphony of reform. This was our legacy, not just the policies changed or the criminals convicted, but the endless ripple of courage, inspiring courage, integrity calling to integrity across the years and miles, until what began as one nurse's refusal to be silent became healthcare's conscience itself.